It was 1979, and I needed to move my apartment from a one-bedroom to a two-bedroom, which was right next door. So I had a bunch of my friends over to help me schlep the stuff from A to B. And as a reward, at the end of the day, I made a big pot of my incredible chicken and walnut chili. Now you should know that my chicken and walnut chili truly is incredible. It includes chickens and walnuts and cannellini and white hominy, and I'm leaving something out, juniper berries. There are no tomatoes in my chicken and walnut chili, but it has lots and lots of green chilies and all of the seasonings and spices that you would expect to find in chili, except tomatoes, which are AWOL. If you're interested, you can go to my website and download a copy of the recipe. So I served my friends with a big pot of chicken and walnut chili, and everybody went home happy and satisfied. And that could have been the end of the story. But it wasn't, because one of my friends happened to be friends with the editor of the women's section. In those unenlightened days, we called it the women's section of the Nashville Tennessean, the newspaper of widest circulation in Tennessee. And so it was he, passed on to her the story of my chicken and walnut chili, and she called me up and made me an offer I could not refuse. She said, you go out and buy the ingredients to make a pot of chicken and walnut chili and all the things that you would normally serve as sides with the chicken and walnut chili, and save your receipt. Cook up all that stuff. We'll come over to your house and taste your food, take pictures of you and the food, and run a little article in the paper. We'll pay you back for all of your expenses. Well, this sounded kind of fun. And so I did. And I don't know how to make just a little bitty pot of chicken and walnut chili. So I made a great big pot of chicken and walnut chili, and I made eggplant stuffed with smoked sausage and an interesting salad with some seaweed and sesame seeds in it, and some sweet potato pie and homemade biscuits. And she came over and I handed her the receipt, and she went, whoa. And then she took a bite of my chicken and walnut chili, and she said, that's incredible. It's worth it. And so then they rearranged my apartment and made me change clothes and took pictures of me. She took a picture, it's one of the stupidest pictures ever taken of me. I'm standing like this, lighting a candle in the middle of my Formica kitchen table. And then she went away. And I had my friends over, and we had another chicken and walnut chili feast. And that could have been the end of this story. But it wasn't. Because about 6 months later, I got an envelope from the Tennessee Department of Corrections. And I hadn't been living a perfectly clean life, but I thought maybe I'd been doing okay. And I hadn't been convicted of anything, so I couldn't quite understand what this was about. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I kind of hoped that I'd get a lot of calls from women after my picture showed up in full color above the fold in the Sunday edition of the women's section of the Nashville Tennessean? I did. I got calls from 4 women. One from a woman I used to date who wanted to know why we broke up. One from each of my sisters and one from my mother. So, anyway, I got this letter from the Department of Corrections, and I opened it up with a little trepidation. And it said, "You are hereby invited to bring a guest and come to the Tennessee Maximum Security Prisons Gourmet Society annual banquet." They had seen the article in the paper and wanted to swap recipes. Well, there was this woman I'd been meaning to go out with. We'd met at a couple of parties, and she sang alto in the Nashville Symphony Chorus. So I called her up and said, "Hey, how'd you like to go out to dinner?" And she said, "Wonderful." So the big night came, and I put on my pleated khakis that were pressed, and I shined up my Weegians, and I put on a Madras shirt and went over to pick her up. And she was stunning. She was absolutely gorgeous. She had on a little strappy black dress and little strappy black heels, and was carrying a little strappy black pocketbook. And her black hair hung down almost to her waist. And she was beautiful. And she said, "Okay, where are we going?" And I said, "It's a surprise." So we went out and got in my car, 1962 Volkswagen convertible, and we're driving along, and at some point it became clear to her that we were not headed to Julian's, which is the most expensive restaurant in Nashville, Tennessee, or was at that time. I don't know what it is now. And she said, "Come on now, you have to tell me where we're going." So I handed her the invitation. And you've never seen 2 lips get thinner. And we got to the prison, and I showed them my invitation, and they swung the big iron gates open. And we drove in, and they swung the big iron gates closed behind us. And then we went through the gate that rolled away with all the razor wire on top. Had to go through that. Then we went into the visitors' parking lot. She has not spoken to me since she saw the invitation. So we go to the visitors' entrance, and I have to empty my pockets and put everything I own in this little basket. And she has to turn in her little black strappy purse. And then a matron took her in the other room and patted her down. And the guard patted me down. So she came out, and her lips were not thin anymore. They had disappeared altogether. And the 2 of us walked. We were accompanied by a guard, and we walked down this long, gray, concrete hall. The floor was polished gray concrete. The walls were gray concrete blocks. And eventually we came to the big dining room, which was also all gray. And all the tables and all the benches were bolted to the floor. And They escorted us to our places. And she had a terrible time getting into her position because she had to get her legs in that little strappy black dress over the bench and under the table. And didn't work very well, but she managed. She got in there, and then each of us had a place setting with a little name tag. And the name tag was decorated with a carrot and an upside down half of a bell pepper cut with a jaggy thing so it looked like a palm. It was a palm tree made out of a carrot and a bell pepper. And so then they brought out the food. And honestly, I think they had done the best job they could with the food that, with materials that were purchased from the low bidder by the Tennessee Department of Corrections. Some of it looked pretty good, but the only thing we were issued to eat it with was a plastic spork. And so all of us, prisoners and guests, were tearing the meat apart with our fingers and trying to eat it and the vegetables. And I noticed that she wasn't eating much. She was not, in fact, eating at all. And they had set us down so that there was a prisoner between each alternating guest, prisoner, guest, prisoner, guest, prisoner. And the prisoner between me and her was a very old African-American chef who was in prison for life without parole for his third murder with a kitchen knife. He didn't have a whole lot to say, but he would answer direct questions, which is how I got that far with him. Across the table from us, there was a young kid, about 27 or 8, who was in prison for murdering his wife and his best friend. He'd gone to Vietnam. He'd grown up on a farm, and he wanted us to know how much he loved the land and how much he loved the soil and the trees. And then he joined the Army and went to Vietnam and shot at people and got shot at. And then he came home and found his wife in bed with his best friend. So he killed them both with his rifle. And now he was in prison. And in case you didn't catch any of that the first time around, he started over. He just wanted us to be sure and get his whole life story. So we struggled with our food and listened to him, occasionally directed a remark to the gentleman to my right, occasionally glanced down the table, and my date hadn't said a word, hadn't picked up her spork, hadn't touched a bite of food, was just staring down. Well, finally dinner was over and the speeches were made. You'd be surprised how much speeching can be done at the Tennessee State Maximum Security Prison Gourmet Society annual banquet. But eventually we got out of there, and all the way back to the car, she never spoke. She still has not spoken to me since I handed her the invitation on the way out. And I'm thinking to myself, I have committed a horrible, horrible sin. I have done something terrible to her. I surprised her. I ambushed her. She wasn't prepared for tonight. She didn't know how to deal with it. I owe her an apology. And all the way back to her house, I was preparing my apology. And basically it involved me getting down on my knees and saying, I am truly, truly sorry that I put you in such an awkward position. And to make it up to you, I would dearly love it if you would give me an opportunity to take you to Julian's to make up for it, because I did a bad thing. I thought it would be fun, but I was wrong. It really wasn't that much fun. So I had all this prepared. I had rehearsed it. I was ready to go. We got to her house. She marched up the stairs. I trailed along behind. She opened the door, unlocked it, swung it open, and she reached inside and grabbed a sign and brought it out and hung it on the door knocker. And it said, "Danger, snakes." And I said, okay, this is maybe a breakthrough. I'm a biologist. I'm not a herpetologist, but I can talk snakes. And I said, golly, that's kind of cool. I didn't know you collected snakes. What kind of snakes do you collect? And she whirled on me and she hissed. There are no snakes, stupid. That sign is to scare niggers away. And then she slammed the door in my face. And I couldn't breathe. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach and didn't know how to get my breath back. And I was filled with hatred and revulsion and anger. And I stumbled down to my car, and I got in, and I drove back to my apartment, and I had no idea how to deal with this. And it took me 2 solid weeks to teach myself what I needed to learn, which is that I didn't need to hate her and I didn't need to be revolted. I needed to be sorry for her. I needed to pity her. And that could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because a couple of years later, I got a call from the Vietnam vet. He was out on early parole and looking for work, hoping he could find something with dirt or trees in it. So I got him a job with the Tennessee Division of Soil and Water Conservation, and I was able to track his career until Linda and I moved to Hawaii. So, you see, chicken and walnut chili, if it's incredible, can take you down a lot of interesting roads, lead to some adventures. But it has to be incredible. So if you want the recipe, it's on my website. Thank you.